Welcome to another movie plot. It opens at a cemetery with a devilishly large man enjoying his bucket of popcorn. A nearby family's mourning for a loved one, but Darren hasn't really passed and is just killing time inside his coffin. The story jumps back to some time earlier where Darren's a relatively popular student with high grades. One day his rebellious best friend Steve convinces the usually well-behaved student to blow off class and hang out with him. The two couldn't be more different, but both have a love for the strange, with Darren spiders and Steve vampire stories. While smashing school property, the two are caught and Darren's told by his parents to never hang out with his bad influence of a friend. The next day on the way to school, Darren tells Steve this, but just that they need to find ways to hang out in secret, when a mysterious car labeled Destiny cruises past and tosses out a brochure. It's for a freak show at the local theater, but the students are warned by their teacher Mr. Kersey not to visit. So naturally that night Darren sneaks out and meets up with Steve to go check out some freaks. At the entrance, a little gray person bites Steve and chucks out 2 tickets, before they're greeted on the inside and directed to the auditorium. Their host Mr. Tall introduces to the people the wolf man who walks around the front of the crowd before biting off a woman's arm. She's the second performer named Corma limbs and has the ability to regrow her missing ones. There's also Alexander Ribs, Gertha Teeth, Ramus Two Bellies, and Evra the Snake Boy. All of who look the way they sound and put on performances assisted by Loafhead. Next, Madame Truska's brought out to perform a psychic reading, choosing Darren out of the crowd. She grows a beard while having a vision of Darren's importance, before quickly chopping it off as the climax to her show and exiting stage. Truska tries to warn another performer about what she saw, but he's running late and speeds out on stage. Mr. Crepsley's recognized by Steve as being a 200-year-old vampire photographed in one of his books. He puts on a show with his spider Madame Octa, who he says one bite from will kill a man, then lands it right on Darren's lap, mesmerizing him. Crepsley retrieves Octa when the show is suddenly broken up by Mr. Kersey arriving with the police. They claim Mr. Tall's exploiting his staff, but when Alexander shows off his namesake, Kersey just can't hold in, shouting freak aloud. Fascinated by the spider, Darren goes backstage to where the vampire keeps his coffin. He locates Octa, but when he hears Crepsley approaching, Darren switches out her cage and hides in a closet. He listens in as Crepsley and his fellow undead Gavner argue about a rival faction called the Vampires that killed their friend Vincent and is picking the vampires off. On top of that, another man called Mr. Tiny's returned and is hellbent on destroying both sides. Their discussions interrupted by Steve, who's returned begging to be made into a vampire since his human life is so terrible with his drunk mother and father who abandoned them. Gavner threatens to know who sent him, but Steve just mentions the photo from the history book and allows Crepsley to taste his blood, which he spits out and says tastes of evil and refuses to turn him. Soon Crepsley realizes that Madame Octa's missing, as Darren flees from the theater through a hidden passage he discovers in the closet. Mr. Tiny's already waiting outside in his Destiny limousine and gives him a lift before Crepsley can catch up. He's accompanied by the Vampires leader Murlough, who gave Crepsley his scars and killed Victor himself. He's not impressed by Darren's appearance, but Tiny takes some of the boy's hair to determine his destiny. After being dropped off at his home, Darren's told by Mr. Tiny that he will keep in touch, then wakes in the morning assuming that their conversation was just a dream. He brings Madame Octa with him to school, but she's discovered by Steve, who accidentally drops her cage, releasing the deadly arachnid in the halls. The two prevent it from escaping, but Octa bites Steve on the cheek and puts him in the hospital with her deadly venom. Darren returns to the theater and to ask Crepsley for help, but he refuses with the excuse that Steve's a little psycho. When he hears that Mr. Tiny was interested in Darren, Crepsley agrees to save his friend on the condition that Darren becomes his half-vampire assistant to prevent him being recruited by the Vampires. When Darren agrees to save the life of his friend, he receives an antidote, and after a quick ritual that leaves Darren with saliva capable of healing wounds, he's taken by Crepsley to the hospital by superspeeding in a process of what the vampire called a flit. It makes Darren sick and the two climb up the side of the building to sneak inside Steve's room. The moment the antidote's applied and his friend's cured, Darren sounds the alarm, alerting nurses and forcing Crepsley to flee. Having already been turned into a half-vampire, Darren begins eating raw meat until one night almost attacking his younger sister. He's visited again by Crepsley, and this time Darren decides to leave with him to protect his family. They first need to stage his death so that no one's looking for him, and Darren's make to drink a tincture before the vampire breaks his neck and apologizes as he throws the boy's corpse from the roof. At his funeral, Steve's suspicious on whether his friend's really dead and has his chewing gum taken by Mr. Tiny to conduct his destiny check on the friend. We catch up to the beginning of the movie where Darren waits patiently while Crepsley unearths his coffin. Just then the vampire smells flesh and Murlough attacks from the shadows in an attempt to kidnap Darren. The protector fights him off, but the killer's much stronger and takes the assistant to recruit him to the Vampires ranks, but Crepsley uses a headstone to trip him up and flits away with Darren to the middle of the highway. When Murlough catches up, he's been lured into the path of an oncoming truck and is incapacitated, giving the vampire enough time to flit the assistant in tiresome stages all the way home to the Cirque du Freak. The place is a community to dozens of outcasts, and Crepsley leaves to speak with Mr. Tall about housing for Darren. They've remained neutral in the war between vampires, which has kept them protected by both sides, but Crepsley believes that Mr. Tiny's returned with sinister intentions for the two boys. Mr. Tall catches both Darren and one of the residents, Rebecca, eavesdropping, but agrees to let him stay with them. The monkey girl, so named for her tail, has Harkat show him to where he'll be staying. The little people are the resurrected corpses of the deceased and can be quite helpful around the campgrounds, and all feed off of dead rats except for Harkat, who seems more aware than the others despite having a tiny decrepit heart. He uses his puppy dog eyes to convince his prey to hold their hand, then takes a bite out of them. One day Mr. Tiny shows up and we see that the little people worship him as he's their creator. Tiny, like the circus, claims to be neutral in the war between vampire and vampanese and has come asking Mr. Tall to give him Darren, but he refuses, unaware of what the sorcerer's intentions with him are. On his way out we see that unlike the other little people, Harakat's getting sick of Tiny's abandonment of them. Darren's taken to his new quarters where Evra's his new roommate and shows him around. The next morning Darren meets the rest of the community and begins with a list of chores left by his master. He maintains Wolfie's hygiene and dusts off Crepsley's coffin. He feeds Madame Octa her food and begins learning to flit. All the while the other little people stalk him around the camp, keeping tabs for their master. Meanwhile Steve's going through it and without his best friend is contemplating jumping from the school roof when he's visited by Tiny. He likes neither vampire nor vampanese and hates to be called a freak himself, but claims to be able to rule the world if only he had a champion. To recruit Steve, he tells him that Darren's still alive and is living his dream as a vampire with a circus. He gets taken to the vampanese and the leader becomes Steve's new mentor after being turned by the army. They intrude on his teacher Mr. Kersey, where Murlough allows his new assistant to do the honors of killing his first human. Darren's given his own training of how to use his hand like a blade and his breath, which can render the living unconscious. One night while Crepsley's picnicking with Truska, vampanese enter the campsite in an attempt to kidnap Darren. He's protected by his new friends and master, who throws the intruders away from him and takes Darren through a passage in his coffin leading to the sewers. Loafhead releases Wolfie, who does what he can but is overwhelmed by his number of attackers, until the freaks come out in full force, all willing to defend one of their own. Mr. Tall threatens the intruders to tell the Vampire Council about this, so they all run away in fear. When Crepsley slumbers in his real coffin, Darren emerges to hear from Evra that the vampanese took Rebecca captive during the attack. Darren leaves and hitchhikes back home, where he finds the house empty as Steve already came by with Mr. Tiny. They brought along Murlough to kidnap the family and left behind a flyer telling him to go to the theater. Darren returns to the now vampanese-infested building and is presented with the 4 hostages strung up. Murlough also reveals Steve, who's happier than ever and resents his best friend for lying to him about being dead. He gives Darren the opportunity to join them by killing Rebecca and they'll let his family live, but Darren refuses and the two begin a fight, which is exactly what Mr. Tiny's been instigating between them the whole time. Crepsley's told by Octa where they're at and goes to the theater to rescue Darren, being told by Truska that he's heading to his doom, but she instantly forgets what she says right after. The vamps allowed entry by Tiny so that he may battle Murlough alongside Darren, who he's brought Octa with to assist. During their fight, Crepsley headbutts out Murlough's tooth but is ultimately overpowered. While the now immune Steve's dealing with the spider, Rebecca frees herself using her monkey tail and offers Darren her blood to regain his strength. When the defeated vampire's about to be executed by Peter, a now replenished Darren flits him away, allowing Crepsley to pick up his knife and stab Murlough through the heart. With him killing their leader, Murlough declares the truce between the two vampire clans to be ended and warns them that an army will avenge him. To keep the vampanese death a secret, Darren tries to kill Steve and they superspeed around the auditorium, but when he gets the chance to finish him off, Darren isn't able. After watching the entire conflict, Tiny descends from a balcony and uses his magic for the first time to easily separate the feuding friends. He takes Steven with him and tells Darren that he'll be back for him when the time's right, then uses a spell to turn the corpse of Murlough into one of his little servants. Steve tells his friend that they both have their own destinies and stays with Tiny to be groomed into the new vampanese leader. Darren returns with his family, where Crepsley hypnotizes them so they forget everything, and leaves for the last time, sharing a kiss with Rebecca out front. At the campsite, Mr. Tall holds a vote to make the vampire a new member, which he wins by majority decision, including the approval of Harakat. After applying a splint to Madame Octa's leg, Gavner returns and congratulates his friend on his victory over the enemy. Crepsley seems to have greater plans for Darren but decides to give him this time to rest, as he's shown presented with a coffin to sleep in as the new member of the Cirque du Freak. And the movie ends.
Not one of those filthy vampires.